Welcome to this year's AGM, and thank you to all our members of board, the General Council, and our various committees. A big welcome to new members of the committees, and thank you to those who finished their term at the end of 2023. My thanks also goes to the volunteers and staff at the OR Society. And I would like to welcome Tanya Petrovic, professor at University of Nottingham. Tanya, it's our new president-elect, and she begins her term of office in January. Just running through today's agenda. We will begin, as is our custom, with our AGM lecture. And it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Chris Dent, who will be talking about two highly topical and controversial infrastructure projects, namely HS2 and energy security, and relating this back to lessons for decision analysis. Seb and I will then follow up and give a brief review of 2023. Seb will review finance and processes, and I will go through the highlights of 2023 before we look at a formal AGM resolution. I'll touch on a number of key projects and priorities that are currently underway in helping us to look to the future. We'll then close with the opportunity for any questions, either about what you've heard today or anything else related to the society's activities. We'll now go to today's lecture. I would like to briefly introduce Professor Chris Dent. I've had a pleasure of working with Chris a few years ago on a project, and I believe he will touch on that. So Chris is a professor of industrial mathematics in the School of Mathematics at the University of Edinburgh and a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. He has the unusual dual status of being an academic in a math school and a fellow of the OR Society. He's also a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. His research interests lie broadly across model and database decisioning support in energy infrastructure and government. In addition to his research work, Chris has a long experience of working on projects with industry, including supporting National Grid, ESO, on analysis underpinning electricity capacity market, being a technical lead on the National Digital Twin program on climate resiliency demonstrator, and a current knowledge exchange project with a Global Power System Transformation Consortium funded by the International Center for Mathematical Sciences in Edinburgh. It's a great pleasure to welcome Chris, and Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can we go to the first slide, please? Excellent, thank you. So, thank you very much, Gilbert, and I'd just like to thank Gilbert and the other organisers for inviting me to give this talk. And when I gave the talk, part of the guidance was that there should be a somewhat interesting sounding title, so I just thought I'd say it like it is. And hopefully these, as well as saying something about topics of current political and media interest, there will also be some lessons for decision analysis and operational research studies here. I should also just explain my job title of industrial mathematics in the School of Mathematics at the University of Edinburgh. The job title of industrial mathematics means that the job advert said that candidates must have had some effect on the world outside academia, which is a fairly radical thing for most academic disciplines, never mind mathematics. Okay, next slide, please. So what is this talk about? It's an example of, well, some pitfalls in decision analysis based on case studies which I've looked at. I'll talk about some direct points on the way forward, but of course, when one's looking at projects where there have been some issues, then part of the message is inevitably, simply don't do this. With HS2, I'll talk particularly about the importance of putting sufficient care and effort into the early stage strategic planning analysis. So this is the early questions of at that high level of what do we build, how big is it, what capacity, what speed, and so on. And this is drawn from a general study of appraisal examples. I've not worked directly on this, but it was a topic of interest arising from a project I led at the Alan Turing Institute called Managing Uncertainty in Government Modelling. I'll then talk about electricity security of supply, which has been a direct specialism for 15 or more years for me, and where I've worked with the industry over that period. Here the particular question is monetization of risk, which is again a very important point often in these large project appraisals. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'd just like to thank some of the people I've talked over HS2 question with. Jim Smith and Henry Wynne were both part of that Turing Institute project. Dominic DeFrancisco is a colleague who I supervise at the Turing Institute now, and Gordon Masterton is a senior civil engineering colleague who at the University of Edinburgh. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm first going to talk about the issue of speed associated with HS2, and this is a topic which I think is very important in the history of HS2, but for reasons that may become clear, hasn't actually been discussed very much in the British media political debate. And the key point here is that there is high speed and there is high speed when it comes to rail, and particularly that the HS2 track is planned for being rated at 400 kilometers an hour, and in Europe, high speed rail basically means 300 kilometers an hour. And so the first part of this talk isn't really about anything technical, mathematical. It's simply about the need to consider the range of relevant options and an example of what can happen if one doesn't. So the first major public presentation of plans for HS2 was the white paper in 2010, which said that the infrastructure is designed for speeds up to 400 kilometers an hour, but it said that this is in line with designs for future routes in Europe. So 400 kilometers an hour was not exactly claimed to be business as usual, but the white paper said that others were planning for it. Some of you may have heard of the Oakervie review in 2020, which was a review, given the delays and cost increases and so on. It was a review of what the future direction should be. And this 10 years after that white paper says that the plans for speed were higher than has been achieved anywhere internationally apart from China. So by 2020, 400 kilometers an hour, or these higher speeds were not business as usual yet. Next slide, please. I then found a very interesting or perhaps telling interview in Rail Engineer magazine with Andrew McNaughton, who was the lead on the early stage design for HS2. And the key point here is that one of the assumptions underlying seems to be that 400-kilometer-an-hour track is barely more expensive than 200-kilometer-an-hour track, which is the current about the current highest speeds in the UK. And I mean, it's just important just to note here that it's saying that 400 kilometers an hour is barely more expensive than 200. It's not saying it's barely more expensive than 300. And I think a lesson from this is that before one actually starts about doing anything clever in analysis, which to some extent is what I and others present might make their living doing. It's important to make sure that you're considering a proper range of options with reasonable data and evidence. And I think it's fair to say that at best, the assumptions around the cost of 400-kilometer-an-hour track and the readiness assumptions for that technology are contentious. It seems that the view of the study is something of a minority view in the rail industry, and also the distances. Even if you were to take the line all the way to Edinburgh and Glasgow, which wasn't the original plan, are actually not very great. And clearly, the cutting edge technology increases the project risks enormously. I mean, 300 kilometers an hour, as much as civil engineering works budgeted in the low tens of billions of pounds can be, 300 kilometer an hour overground railway is as near as that kind of thing can be to an off-the-shelf project. But it's very striking that by the time of the 2010 papers on HS2, there was no mention in them of 300 kilometers an hour being an option. It seemed that the decision to go for the cutting edge speeds was not consulted. Okay, next slide, please. So where there was then the detailed, there was more detailed presentation of the case, was in the in project appraisals published in 2011 to 2012, and these are in the language of these things, these are fairly classic Green Book type policy appraisals. The Green Book being the HM Treasury document, which is the top level guide to how these kinds of appraisals should be done. And this looks at I mean, this table just summarizes the economic case presented. There are two versions of it in 2011 and 2012, and two versions of the network. For the London to West Midlands, so essentially the London to Birmingham line, which is what we're actually ending up with, and the Y network, which includes the railway up to Manchester and Manchester and Leeds. And the one point I find very striking here, again, this is as someone who works works in decision analysis, it was very striking that the economic benefits are stated as in the 40s billions, with quite a small uncertainty range of about plus or minus 5 to 10%, which seemed on first sight implausibly narrow to me on any estimate of almost anything produced by any means, looking some decades ahead over the operational lifetime. And it's also with these kinds of appraisals, it can be typical to use a government-defined interest rate, a discount rate for particular purposes. which expresses a defined level of societal interest in benefits now versus benefits later. But even then, it's important to note that these figures would be very sensitive to discount rates. So if you have a 1 point change in the discount rate over 20 years, that will be more, that will give you more than a 20% change in any of the figures. Next slide, please. And just to dig down a little bit more into the stated economic benefits. So these are what are regarded as the narrow estimate or the direct economic benefits, not the wider economic impacts, which are around matters such as economic development. These are the line items into which this is broken down. The majority is journey time savings. The one point is that none of these are cash flow. These are all benefits which are naturally measured in some other kind of scale and then are monetized. And this brings the question of to what extent are these actually commensurate with the capital cost. Commensurate is a technical term that's sometimes used for whether items are comparable on the same numerical scale, which in practice usually ends up meaning are they non-cash flow items monetizable. And monetization of non-cash flow items is inevitably uncertain. And there's a example of this with HS2 that's become very prominent in the general media, which I've referred to as the infamous valuation of business people's time. So next slide, please. This section of the talk does turn a little bit death by PowerPoint because I've proceeded to a large extent by quoting various reports in a way that I hope is enlightening. So the 2011 appraisal states, well, I've underlined the key quote, these values assume that workers are not able to work productively during the course of their journey. And this is a standard assumption used in transport appraisal. So directly that assumption has been, well, it's been widely quoted in the general media. I mean, it's also in terms of what is directly said, it's been accurately quoted. Of course, there are obvious caveats here. Was it ever the case that time spent on trains was unproductive? I mean, I had my own work laptop from 2009. I could borrow one from about 2002. Even before that, could people bring the right paperwork to work effectively? And one thing my dad says, which is actually quite relevant to HS2 because it's on one of the routes that were planned, when he was commuting weekly from Manchester to London in the mid-1980s, he actually said it was the 2.5-hour train journey that made his job doable. Because no one could contact him, and therefore he could actually get on with work. So in direct terms, if you take this at face value, it's obviously not a correct assumption, but then there is this comment about further investigation in chapter 7. So let's find out what's in chapter 7. Next slide, please. So I've quoted, obviously, collapsing an entire section of a report onto 3/4 of a slide. I've had to quote quite selectively here, but I think I've quoted reasonably fairly. There are various different options considered for how one might monetize the savings in journey time. some extent, this is simply saying you have a particular framework and you might use different numbers. Also, to some extent, it's saying that you can conceptualize this in a different way. You can actually use different frameworks. But then, in terms of how they ultimately did this, it does turn a little bit sort of trust us, we're the experts, and they picked one approach with some commentary around this, saying that this is reasonable given the alternative approaches available. Okay, next slide again, please. So in terms of what kind of technical modeling issues we have here, I mean, some of these differences between possible monetizations are what you might call normal, not normal distribution, but simply normal, the standard business of parametric uncertainty, where one could easily do a sensitivity analysis. But you do also touch here on different possible conceptualizations, where you have different possible, quite different frameworks for how you might monetize something. This is not an idea, not an area that seems to have been studied very much. It's certainly not parametric uncertainty. By definition, you're going beyond something. Points where you're changing the numbers. It's not a scope uncertainty. I'll talk a little bit about scope uncertainties in the second section of the course, where you simply have to decide what's in scope for a calculation. It's not quite that. It's not multi-model uncertainty, where you have different models that are trying to do essentially the same thing. It's something quite different from this. I mean, it's a more it's actually a more overt issue in some other areas, where you're looking to monetize what variously might be termed social or cultural or environmental value or capital. On time savings, there are fairly obvious routes, and I say routes plural, to monetization. But equally, there are some possible differences in conceptualization. So we're in something of a halfway house here. And in terms of, concerns I have with how this is both treated and presented in the HS2 appraisal, there's certainly no principal framework given for uncertainty in the value of time. I mean, ultimately, what they seem to do is just pick one of the possibilities. So any kind of principal framework they have doesn't feed into how the numbers were ultimately produced. Details of calculations and sensitivity analyses are not presented. It's very difficult to identify exactly where any statements of uncertainty originate. And as I say, it's common in these situations, with something like environmental capital being being a very good example in appraisals, to use to find a way of monetizing and use that, whereas there might be other quite different but equally sensible, equally sound ways of going about this. And then, of course, as I said, some of the uncertainty ranges look implausibly narrow. And as a general point, if one does acknowledge properly the possible sources of uncertainty, then better decision making ought to result. One concern there, of course, is that one can end up with in some kind of paralysis by analysis. And a very important point then is how one does bring potentially quite large uncertainties in benefits into decision processes, so that one can move forward. Another general point here, which I think this is perhaps an example of, is that often it seems that in these early strategic planning questions of what does one build, how big do we make it, and so on, there's insufficient resource put into the analysis that underpins these early strategic questions. I ran a few years ago a research network for the Centre for Digital Built Britain on planning analysis for infrastructure projects, and A point that we road tested in one of the workshops there was well, it was a point I made around scale of early strategic analysis not being well aligned with the scale of capital budgets. I mean, the budget for analysis might be many orders of magnitude smaller. And I expected this to be a slightly contentious point and that we'd have some interesting discussion and we'd be able to write up this interesting discussion. And what happened was that I just said this, everyone in the room agreed, and it went in the report. We took that as evidence that this is not a view. It's not a view that's always stated, but it's not a maverick view. Another question which I started thinking of, but based on a book that I'd read some years before by King and Crew. I actually haven't put the title of the book on this slide. The book is actually called The Blunders of Our Governments, and they did list. They wrote the book in about 2014, and they did list HS2 as a potential future blunder, but they decided it wasn't far enough down the track, as it were, yet for it to be listed as one of their list of what they termed blunders. But the main point of that book was questioning whether decision processes in UK policy can often be insufficiently deliberative, that there isn't sufficient consideration of the risks or the uncertainties or the range of options associated with large projects. And again, it's a point that I make, that you don't want this to result in paralysis by analysis, but you don't want to, and equally you don't want to end up with very large decisions being made without sufficient consideration. And potentially this point around the very optimistic cost estimates for very high-speed rail could fall into this category of whether there was insufficient deliberation through apparently only ever consulting outside the Department of Transport on the 400 kilometre an hour option. Okay, next slide. I've spent a little bit more time than I'd intended to on the HS2, so I'll talk about valuing electricity reliability relatively briefly. And this is an example of I'm not sure whether I should have said controversial here. It's certainly a very politically prominent issue. I mean, ultimately, energy security of supply is one of the highest level priorities for government. So just to introduce this, can you just be no, next slide please, but be prepared for this one, that this one has a few things to fly in. So next one. So the media headlines on this topic illustrate why it's such a high priority. These become major media items. So this is the California blackout. Actually, can you wait for me to say before bringing the next one in? The California blackout 20 odd years ago. Is perhaps the best example of this. I mean, this was to some extent problems with market design, but when they had rolling blackouts for many days consecutively, this is for California, which would like to style itself as one of the world's most advanced economies. This is not what they're looking for, and it causes massive direct damage, but also massive reputational damage. Next one, please. And the reason that and the best illustration of why politicians care so much is that this is Governor Gray Davis of California, he was at that time Governor Gray Davis, and of course Governor Gray Davis, and of course as again is fairly well known, the California power crisis contributed to him being replaced a few years later by this gentleman. So next one. And then if you can just bring in the next one, please. So I can remember exactly where I was at 6 p.m. on the 5th of October 2012, because I was sitting on my sofa back in the days when I did get home for 6 p.m. and I put the BBC News on, and I discovered that the project that I'd been involved in was the lead headline on the news. And I thought that this is no longer the normal business of academic research, Chris. But this illustrates what a big political story it is, at least if it looks like there are signs of possible problems. Of course, the next year the outlook from the report was much more benign, and no one cared. And it's not this area doesn't just result in news stories on the BBC. Next one, please. There was actually a very good interview with Andrew Wright, who was at the Ofgem, the energy regulator. In the Sun newspaper, and so a topic has really made the mainstream of thought when you get a pretty serious article and interview in Britain's most popular tabloid newspaper. Okay, next slide, please. The point I'd like to address is actually another one around monetization. And the standard monetization used for supply reliability is to calculate the expected energy unserved, so the expected total deficit in the future year you're interested in of between supply and demand, and take as a risk index a probability weighted average over possible outcomes, and then multiply this by a per megawatt hour, so per unit of energy value of lost load. And this value of lost load is usually a straight average over different customers and is survey based. So it looks only at direct effects based on the survey data. And you end up with this ends up in some sense recommending an optimal, in inverted commas, level of reliability, which is given by the ratio of the cost of new entry, so the unit cost of procuring new generating capacity, and the value of lost load. So it seems that, well, job done here. There's a simple definition that looks quite sensible. Most people seem to agree with this. So where's the problem? Next slide, please. There are two perspectives here. The left-hand panel here is actually taken from a government document about 12 years ago, which was looking at an appropriate level for reliability of supply estimate for Great Britain. So putting in the standard numbers for cost of new entry and value of lost load gives a few hours per year on average of disconnections. And note that there's a typo there, not should be note, that this means disconnecting some people due to a shortfall on at Great Britain level. It doesn't mean the whole system shuts down. It just means that some people don't get supply for a few hours. And the right-hand panel just illustrates, this was actually a news story about the electricity system operator not being sure some hours ahead of real time that they would have their usual quite substantial operating headroom. So this was nowhere near a shortfall. It's not having that uncertainty hours ahead of real time doesn't even mean that they don't have their normal operating headroom in real time, because you can bring on additional resource, or maybe you just get lucky with how everything goes relative to forecasts. So there's some tension here. We have this 3 hours per year standard for the average duration of shortfall periods set in statute, but you would have a media political crisis if the system was as unreliable as that. Next slide, please. So it looks as if we have some disconnect between the way that the calculations have been done and the actual interests of decision makers. So this there are various issues with the standard monetization. One is that it simply averages everyone's interests. When you're not discriminating about who you disconnect, should you be using a higher or more marginal value of lost load to account for that lack of discrimination? It's a narrow perspective of direct damages. This is what I referred to earlier as scope uncertainty. If you take a much broader perspective, if our energy system develops a reputation for being flaky, this has major consequences for economic confidence, societal confidence, inward investments, and so on. It's risk neutral. It works in terms of expected money, which would usually not be thought a relevant utility function if we're dealing with rare serious events. One would need to place more weight on bad outcomes. And more generally, there's this point of, are investment costs and reliability really commensurate? Can they actually naturally be compared in units of money? This isn't to say that we can't use the standard framework at all. I mean, obviously, one thing one could do is look at a very different framework, which directly accounts for all of those issues. I mean, another way you could maintain the standard framework would, instead of basing the value of lost load on a stated preference of customers and various other assumptions, you could calculate an implied level of value of lost load. Based on the stated preference of decision makers or the sort of political consensus over how reliable the system should be. And once you've calculated that for the an implied level of value of lost load for the present system, you could then use that in the exactly the same structure of calculation in other circumstances to give with the intention of giving a system that might look very different, but which would have an analogous level of reliability. And a couple of caveats here. Caveat one, the fact that you have this expected value index being the same is not everything. You can have the same value of this index made up of more or fewer, less or more severe days. So one certainly needs to check that out. And you've also got certainly if you make a change from the standard for the current standard picture, you would have issues of transparency beyond the specialist community. Okay, I'm realize I'm getting a bit short on time, so I'll just can you go to the next slide, please? I was planning to say a little bit more about this, but I was just going to also place a caveat on that people often talk about uncertainty in future climate. One interesting point that I and colleagues are thinking about at the moment is uncertainty in characterizing present climate. And the issue here is that we're dealing with rare events, and the trouble when you're looking to make statistical estimates with rare events is that they, by definition, they don't happen very often. And you don't really resolve this by adding in more years of data because firstly, however many years of data you have, you've probably still got 3 years, which are the 3 worst years. But actually, what happens in Great Britain is that as you add in more data, you actually bring in more extreme outliers of cold weather events in the 80s before you get back to the questions of could the famous severe winters like 62, 63, and 46, 47 recur. So another factor here, which again, if in principle, if one confronts this head on, should result in better decision making is uncertainty in any statistical estimates associated with these kinds of extremes. Okay, can you skip forward 2 slides, please, and I'll get to conclusions. So just to conclude, I've looked at 2 examples of prominent policy questions where there are decision analytic points in play. I've looked at HS2, which raised questions over how one should look at uncertainty treatment for these kinds of appraisals, and there were particularly seemed to be various issues associated with the early stage strategic analysis before the basic approval for the project was given. And then there's this question relating to the book that I cited of whether this is a wider example of there being insufficient deliberation in setting Great Britain policy at these early stages. And then I also looked at electricity security of supply, where again we had issues of monetization of, in this case, of a slightly different kind of relevant quantity. And I think it's an interesting case study here of the need to make sure that the objective of decision makers is properly reflected in the objective function that's used, or the utility function that's used in any technical analysis. And there's a wider point here that what one really should be doing in these cases is co-designing the system model used, the uncertainty treatment within this model, and use and how all of this is used in supporting decision making. And what very often happens is that these are, if indeed the uncertainty treatment and use and decision support are studied carefully, these 3 points are often studied sequentially, which frequently means that one has a system model which is too complex for the kind of uncertainty treatment that is, well, in principle and in practice required. And finally, can you just skip to the final slide, please? So I've just given a few references here. The first one is the link to the economic appraisal for HS2. There's the book by King and Crew, which is actually a very, very interesting book, and variously darkly entertaining in its way, and quite scary. But it's a very, very interesting detailed analysis of many things that we've probably heard of in the general media. There's an early article on points around commensurability of different quantities, which I think is both very readable and still very valid. There's a item in the House of Commons library which summarises the mid-2000s Eddington study of transport options in the UK. I actually learned about this from one of the attendees of this talk when it was too late really to integrate this into the study. But the Eddington study actually did prefigure some of the conclusions associated with HS2 that I and colleagues reached. There's an article, and there are a couple of articles I and colleagues have written. One is specifically on these questions around electricity capacity, which is written for a reasonably general mathematical audience. So probably this kind of OR Society audience would find it approachable. It's not too specialist. And then there's also a more general one about model-based decision making. Thank you very much. I hope that was interesting. Maybe even, dare I say, I hope it was instructive, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. And yeah, Seb would handle Q&A before we move to the next part of the agenda. So Seb, please. Yeah.
Yeah, and I noticed that in case anyone is having trouble sleeping, that Ian Mitchell has posted in the chat a link to the HM Treasury Green Book, which I can promise you is a thoroughly riveting read. But it is actually very well, if you're interested in these things, it's well worth looking at that, because that is the source document from which much else flows, and does actually contain very sensible discussion on some of these points.
Great, thank you. I can't see any questions that have come in so far. So if anyone has got a question for Chris, now's a good time to ask it, either through the chat, or I think you've got a raise hand function as well. I can't see any. Okay. Oh, we have one actually from Ian. Ian asks, we have a green and magenta books for the appraisal and evaluation stages of the ROA MEF cycle. Any suggestions for the, just trying to read that, the Carely strategic analysis? Or
Yeah,
do you see that,
I'm
Chris?
not. I don't think I can actually. I can see.
Oh, early strategic analysis.
Yeah, I think that the uh, one comment I would say. I mean, I made reference to the Green Book being very sensible on these things. One one impression I always have is that there's a difference between the what these documents actually say and the custom and practice. And what seems to happen is that um, the uh, desire for monetization often pushes further than a reading of the government documents necessarily implies. I mean, I sometimes not totally unfairly caricature some custom and practices. If you can monetize. If you can't monetize anyway. If you really can't monetize, then you think about it. But I think actually if you have at least I mean, obviously I come from a very particular perspective, but I think if one makes a fair reading of these documents, it might it might imply less of a push towards monetization, or at least supplementing that by other forms of analysis. I mean, one very simple point is that if you have a monetized cost benefit analysis, it's often very instructive to simply break that down into the line items and look at how this balance of the separate items separate in parallel with looking at the headline calculation, because this isn't exactly rocket science, but it will tell one whether we're dealing with everything that comes in, whether we're dealing with everything naturally starting off as money. It will tell you about the extent to which one's comparing present monetary sums with sums that live in the far future, and so on. And yes, I noticed associated with this, there's also mention here of the Aqua Book, which I probably should have cited here, which is an extremely good guide at high level to how one should to what constitutes quality analysis in government. It's written for government, but it's not only relevant to government. And within its scope, it's as I say, it's a very high quality manual. What it doesn't have in scope is the technical detail of how one proceeds, particularly when you're dealing with very complex circumstances. And often particular challenge arises when you're dealing with computationally intensive modeling. I mean, as models grow, typically for uncertainty treatment, you need more runs, and as the model grows, you can do fewer, and you end up in a kind of catch-22 situation. And that's an area where I think partly my own sector, the research sector, is somewhat at fault, because there hasn't been enough concentration on developing practically deployable methods for confronting those issues head on.
Yeah. I had a raised hand from Julian de Villas. I can allow Julian, if you've still got a question, I can allow you to come in and just and talk and ask your question. If you'd like, you're now off. If you unmute, you should be able to speak. Are you there, Julian? Julian? Okay, if he's not there, Bob's got a quick question as well on the chat, which is sensible decision analysis as suggested here impossible, given the political nature of government decisions in many policy areas?
Yeah, I mean, this is the old this kind of slightly black joke or dark joke about do we have evidence-based policy or policy-based evidence? I think I mean there are challenges, and I think I mean some of this I mean, I've referenced technical challenges with how one does the relevant analysis. The and I mean, there's an extent to which it's there's an extent to which also in a democratic society it is legitimate for government to make judgment calls. I would say that we need to do what we can, and I think in particular there are some I mean there are some simple there are some points which don't always seem to be addressed to the extent they might be, about whether a full range of options is considered, whether the relevant reports have appropriately stated the risks from complex projects. I mean, I'm actually quite comfortable with with a substantial degree of judgment call being involved in these these kinds of decisions, because I think often monetary CBA is thought of as a bit more of a gold standard than in many cases it actually is, and it can be better to recognise head on that there is a degree of judgment here, but I think it's important that you have the relevant range of knowledge and range of options on the table, so at least perhaps there have to be reasons given or reasons documented for why a particular judgment has been taken.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I don't think there's any other questions that have come in now. There are lots of great resources that have been posted in the chat as well. So that's excellent. So I think I'll hand back to Gilbert, and thank you for your time this afternoon, Chris.
Thank you very much. Thanks again, Chris. And we'll now move to the next item on today's agenda, reviewing 2023, and Seb will kick off with our financial review, and then I will talk about some of the highlights of 2023. Seb, please.
Thank you, Gilbert. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention a few highlights really of what work we undertook in 2023. We firstly, when I came into post in January 2023, we looked at the strategy that we currently had, which was set in 2019-2020, and that covered the 2020 to 2026 period. So we undertook a piece of work to revise that strategy and business plan and launch a new business plan for 24 to 27. We also planned and launched our 75th anniversary celebrations, which commenced at OR65, our annual conference in Bath in 23. And we also invested in some targeted public relations campaign to make use of the the anniversary and improve our visibility, showcase some of our work and our members. And of course, we also begun work to look to diversify our income and plan some projects which you'll hear about shortly, in providing a really firm foundation to be able to grow and remain sustainable for the longer term. But you'll hear a bit about that in due course. In terms of the financials situation, the main headlines essentially are that we're in a relatively healthy position financially. We're fortunate that we've got some significant investments, and at the end of 2023, our total net assets stood at 2.31 million. This was a £63,000 net shift in our funds below that of 2022, but wasn't as bad as it could have been, because our investments recovered somewhat from the volatility over the previous few years and the downturn in those investment returns. So investments income recovered, but income was still down, and that was mostly due to the expected drop in publications revenue. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in due course. And the other sort of highlight or point to note really is that the financial picture really demonstrates the challenges in income, but also that we're delivering careful cost control measures, because both our income was down in 2023, but so was our expenditure. So there we are. And the expected drop in publications revenue is largely, if not exclusively, to do with the changing revenue model linked to open access. But in terms of our publishing, our contract remains with Taylor and Francis. I think we get a good level of support from Taylor and Francis. They undertake the editorial back office function on our behalf. But of course, there are those income risks from open access and Plan S. And we're looking at what mitigations we can deploy to minimize those risks, given that a significant proportion of the Society's income over many, many years has been from our publications, our journal income. We saw a bit of a bounce back really with improved income from events and conferences in 2023, which was good to see. I think partly that's a return from people being happy to travel and meet post-COVID, and they bounced back well. Training income, on the other hand, though, proved more challenging. I think as we see people's training sort of requirements sort of changing and evolving to a more sort of modular based self-learning on-demand training, rather than sort of structured tutor-led training, which historically our training has focused on. So in summary, really, on the financials, our total funds were down slightly at the end of 2023 to 2.31 million. There was an income over expenditure deficit of £63,000. It would have been more than that, but we were helped by our investment returns picking back up. And of course, board remains cautious, quite rightly, both to protect our cash position, but they also recognise a need for careful investment to enable us to diversify our income and grow the Society, and it's remain sustainable over the longer term. So just a couple of pie charts for you in terms of where our income comes from in 2023. You can see there that by far publications income is still our greatest source of revenue. This has come down slightly to 59% of our revenue. It was up at about 70% in 2022. So you can see that it's slowly becoming less of an exclusive, if you like, revenue stream for us, but nonetheless it remains highly significant for the society. Next biggest revenue is from events and conferences at 21%, then subscription income at 11%, training income at 5%, investment income at 3%. And those figures are in thousands, so 822,766 for publications, and the other amounts similarly in thousands, which gave us a funding an income in 2023 of 1.4 million. In terms of our expenditure, this again takes all our expenditure and aggregates the sort of fixed costs of our staffing costs and office costs and things like that. So this is a lot more diverse in terms of our expenditure. 27%, the largest proportion is towards what we class as other charitable expenditure, but that's all work that we do that meets our charitable objectives, things like pro bono, our work across research, education, etc. So there's a big, and also all the sort of office costs and the costs of keeping the organization running. And the other areas there are split down into 25% costs for events and conferences. Obviously, they're expensive to organize. Publications costs of 18%, website digital services at 10%, and subscription costs of 9% servicing the membership. So it gave us an expenditure of 1.51 million in 23. Just a final slide from me, really, in terms of our reach. Membership and supporter numbers continue to improve. At the end of 2023, we pushed through the 4,000 membership, 4,000 member points. So we're over 4,000 members now. Our LinkedIn followers continue to track up, so that's good. And you can see we've increased corporate partners. So in terms of membership growth, it's an 8% growth from 2022 to 2023. And we've got 394 of our members accredited. That's across 165 fellows, 75 associate fellows, 50 associates, and 104 candidate associates. So I'm going to hand over to Gilbert, who will talk about some of the sort of product and service highlights from 2023. Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Seb. Yeah, we have made a lot of progress on the three strands of our mission. Firstly, ensuring that we create a vibrant community for our research and practice. Second, it's being visible in terms of our brand and as a community, and also the discipline of OR. And then thirdly, adding value to our members and wider society at large. 2023 was an important year for the society, and not least because we celebrated 75 years of operational research in the UK. Highlights for the year included developing the scope and reach of our in-person and online delivery of services, building a new senior leadership team, so that well done to Seb and the team, responding to the declining publication income. So alluded to some of the initiatives being undertaken to address those concerns, and one of those areas is achieving readiness to deliver the level 7 apprenticeship for an operational research specialist, and also the society becoming an endpoint assessment awarding body. And We continue to contribute to both the Alliance for Data Science Professionals, playing a key role in the Council of Mathematical Sciences and the development of the Academy for Mathematical Sciences. And we are working with Validate AI to develop capabilities and courses for assuring AI. And this, again, will address some of the concerns around diversifying our portfolio in terms of revenue streams. Other highlights include the work that is being done by WORAN, and that is Women in Oral and Analytics Networks, both in terms of the number of participants and its activities during the year. We also continue our valuable charitable work through our pro bono OR projects. Quite a lot of good work that has taken place over the years, again, and demonstrating the three strands of our mission. Next slide, please. We had a very successful Bill Blackett and Oral 65 conference. So the Bill lecture, the theme, again, reflecting on 7 decades in oral, was given by Professor Robert Dyson. The Blackett lecture followed a similar path, reflecting the theme of our anniversary, that is past, present, and future. And we had 3 speakers, so Dr. Roger Porter, Paul Clark, and Professor Alison Etheridge. Each of them gave a perspective on what the society, mainly Roger focused on the past. Paul talked about some of the work that is being done around simulation and modeling. And then Alison talked about our role as a society with the academy, which is a focus for us going forward. The conference was also very successful. We were at Bath. It was very well attended and very insightful in terms of the presentations that were given. Next slide, please. So again, just leveraging on the 75th anniversary, we have launched a number of initiatives to increase our visibility, and there has been huge increase in external PR, placing OR in articles in various sector magazines, publications, and we look to building on this this year. Some of the examples of our current and future work also includes, looking at how we can reach out to youngsters through our ORI program and the work that the team is doing, the OR staff are doing, some coming up next year with events in Birmingham reflect on this. I want to say a huge thank you to our members who have inputted into the branding and repositioning of the work that a society does, either through discovery, focus groups, research, or web surveys. This has all been great input into our website and CRM projects. We also undertook a strategic project revisiting our strategy, and thank you to all those who provided inputs to help shape what we now, and we are going to share that our strategy going forward. Thank you very much. We'll now move to the formal section of the AGM, and I would like to highlight that we have received no apologies, and Seb will, he has a record of all the attendees, and he will run through each resolution and voting. Seb, over to you, please.
Thanks, Gilbert. Yeah, so there's 6 resolutions for us to deal with. As is the format for these over the last few years, there's no voting today, but we've received votes electronically or by post in advance of the meeting, and all the votes have been counted. For simplicity, I've asked members of, so Francis O'Brien and Bob Scott have kindly agreed to be noted as the proposer and seconder for the 6 resolutions. So we'll run through them in turn, if that's okay, and then we can answer any questions at the end of the proceedings. So although it says resolution 2 on here, which is item number 2 on the agenda, this is to approve the minutes of the AGM held on the 22nd of June last year. So the first 3 resolutions just require a simple majority, and then the 3 special resolutions which relate to the annual subscription rates for 2025 onwards, and the accreditation application fees and the accreditation fees for 2025 onwards, they're special resolutions which require a 75% majority. So the minutes of the annual general meeting from the 22nd of June, there was just one action, so one matter arising, which was just a typo on the medal recipient notes at the end of the annual report, and that's been updated. So the voting on the AGM, the minutes were 25 for, none against, and 8 abstentions, so that has passed. The next resolution was to approve the annual report and accounts for the year ended 31st December 2023. They were posted in advance of the meeting, and they're available online on our website. The detailed accounts and the annual trustees report. And again, these require a simple majority, and the votes were cast as follows: 28 in favour, 1 against, and 1 abstention. So the resolution for the annual report and accounts were passed. The next resolution is to reappoint our auditors, Sayer Vincent, as our auditors to the society for the forthcoming year, which will be the 2024 financial year for auditing. Again, a simple majority was required, and we had 28 votes in favour, none against, and 5 abstentions. So that was passed as well. Now we move on to the special resolutions. And as is the case with the special resolutions, they are to set the annual subscription rates for membership with effect from the forthcoming calendar year, which will be the 1st of January 2025. The proposal, the recommendations have been passed through the Publicity Membership and Website Committee, onto the Finance Committee, and then finally to Board, who have agreed the recommendations to put forward to the membership. And the recommendations is from the 1st of January that the ordinary rate of membership is £105 for the year, or £94 if paid by direct debit, and the reduced rate is £69 or £61.50 if paid by direct debit. This represents, on the ordinary rate, a 10% increase of fees, and on the reduced rate, 7.5% increase on fees. So the votes, 25 were in favour, 3 against, and 5 abstentions, which has meant that the resolution has passed with a 76% majority. Next up is the accreditation application fees with effect from the 1st of January 2025. Again, these recommendations have been passed through PMW, Finance and Board. And for each, the fellow accreditation, the associate fellow, and the associate fees. Application for accreditation are set as follows: £91, 65 and 40. Again, these increases are in line with the membership increase at the reduced rate, so 7.5% on increase on current rates. And of course, the candidate ORS application remains free. So voting 26 in favour, 1 against, 6 abstentions, 79% majority. So that has passed as well. And finally, the accreditation add-on rate for accreditees. This is again, and sorry, there's a typo I've just noticed on this slide. This should read from the 1st of the 1st, 2025 again. And these are the fees recommended to PMW Finance Committee and Board again. And the amounts again are in line with the reduced rate for membership fees, which is 7.5% increase. And the fees are there, £36.50 a year, or £3.04 by direct debit for 4s, £29.50, £2.45 by direct debit for associate fellow, and £19 or £1.58 by month by direct debit for associate. Again, required a 75% majority, 26 voted in favour, 1 against, 6 abstentions. So that resolution has passed as well with a 79% majority. So that brings us to the end of the formal part of the AGM with all the resolutions. And it's just now an opportunity for members to ask any questions or make any comments if there are any. I will hand back to you, Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Seb. And Janet, yes, I agree. Quite disappointing in terms of the number of members voting. Yeah. We'll welcome any ideas to help increase that.
And there was 1 vote against the annual report and accounts. And I don't know we don't know the reasons because we don't ask, but if the person is potentially on the on the meeting, they could say, or if not, then that's fine as well. But I should just reiterate that the annual report and accounts have been fully audited by Sayer Vincent, and we received a clean bill of health, if you like, from our auditors on that. And those regulatory requirements with filing at Companies House and Charities Commission will be done following the AGM today.
Any questions?
I'm just checking if there's any others. Any thoughts on the mix of in-person, remote and hybrid meetings for the OR Society governance meetings? I don't know if you want to comment on this, Gilbert. I suppose we do have one in-person board meeting each year. And I think I don't really have a view otherwise on the mix of in-person, remote and hybrid. Clearly there's costs involved with people traveling and things, but certainly I'll be led by the board and the president.
You're absolutely right, Seb. So that was a decision from the board. Of course, next year definitely we'll review that in light of our finances and the appetite as well. Post-COVID, quite difficult to get the numbers up when we need. So we just want to make sure that we get the balance right. But for next year, definitely something for the board to look at. either increasing for board meetings or also getting a general council meeting face to face.
And I would just say, just commenting on the comment from Sue, I think or Janet, I think it was, numbers of voting and attendance is consistent with recent years. So notwithstanding the fact that I agree with, the numbers are disappointing, but they are similar to what we've seen in recent years. Yeah, and that's, I think, reiterated by David, David Lane in the chat. So thanks, David. And Bob's kindly noted that, of course, our regional networks and our special interest groups have regular meetings and offer face-to-face opportunities to meet up as well.
Good point. And Blackett,
and Blackett,
thank you,
of
Bob.
course. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, we have the conference coming up, a huge opportunity for us to get together. So
yeah,
let's take advantage.
Probably gives us a good opportunity to mention those dates then.
Yes,
Gilbert.
please,
so
yeah.
Just to say that all our events are online on our website, that you can, members can look to see when the dates of things are upcoming. Bangor this year, the University of Bangor for OR66 is the 10th to the 12th of September this year, and our Blackett lecture is back at the Royal Society on Thursday, the 5th of December. So there we are.
That's good. Well, yeah, no questions. We'll bring. Okay, and of course, David. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So there are. I mean, on a positive note, there are opportunities for members to get to meet. And yeah, let's do that at Vanguard as Seb highlighted. Okay, and the simulation workshop and exit as well next year. Great. Thank you very much for joining this year's AGM, and thanks for your participation. And also a big thank you to Professor Chris Dent for the talk. Very insightful. I also want to take the opportunity on behalf of the board to thank Seb and the team at the OR Society HQ for all the work that they've done over the past year. Thank you very much, and we'll bring the meeting to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.